He represented this level of Black exceptionalism.
Just a day after news broke General Colin Powell succumbed to complications from COVID-19, the world is still reflecting on his complicated legacy.
One thing I remember he said in his book was, the higher up you go, you have to become a selfless leader.
Powell broke barriers on several fronts, but some within the Black community are taking a critical look at his career.
Colin Powell was a little complex, especially when it came to the Black community in different ways.
You ask an important question, Brother Small. This is critical. So indeed, Colin Powell is coming of age in Republican politics at a very important point in American foreign policy.
Colin Powell was born and raised in the Bronx in New York City by Jamaican immigrant parents. He began his decorated career in the Army in 1958. He served in Vietnam in the late 1960s and eventually found himself working in the Pentagon. Powell worked closely with top national security officials, and by the 1970s and 80s, he was advising the Carter and Reagan administrations in areas of national security. But it was during this time Powell found himself at the center of America's empire-building effort, says Dr. Kurt Young of Clark Atlanta University.
Colin Powell is a part of an American empire-building push that has a number of important components. One component is that it's connected to American economic interests across the planet. So it's a military force and an economic force that's matched to it. And so that kind of role that Colin Powell played in that kind of space will lead to, in many ways, the constructing of this empire status that I'm talking about.
In 1989, Powell became a four-star general, and in 1991, he was nominated chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the first Black officer to assume the position. He led the Joint Chiefs during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 and led the State Department when the War on Terror began during the George W. Bush administration.
He's had his fingerprint on, so much that has happened with us in terms of domestic and especially foreign policy over the last few decades.
Powell's legacy would take another turn in 2003 while serving as Secretary of State.
The image that's going to define his legacy, despite all of those complexities we just talked about, will be that image of him making his presentation in front of the United Nations General Security Council.
On February 5, 2003, in a speech before the United Nations, Powell falsely claimed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction during the lead-up to the Iraq War that left hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead and has destabilized the region to this day. A year later, he confessed there were no weapons of mass destruction. And in 2011, he said his UN speech is a blot on his record.
But this idea of distrust that became a consistent thread during the Bush administration, he sat at the core of this, and it is something that hurts his legacy.
On the political front, Powell broke tradition when he supported Barack Obama in 2008 and in 2012 over his Republican challengers, Mitt Romney and John McCain. He did not support Donald Trump either and was very critical of him and his influence on the Republican Party.
There is an emerging legacy of former Republicans who break from the party and begin to attach themselves to a more forceful identification with the Democratic Party in the context of the Trump era.
Colin Powell was a man of complexity, breaking racial barriers, but also embroiled in controversial military invasions and political decisions. And while his lasting legacy will live on, the answer to whether he's perceived as a hero or another contentious political figure rests in the minds and hearts of those you ask. Reporting for Atlanta Black Star, I'm Cavante Smalls.